He thought his wedding day would be the happiest day of his life, the moment when years of waiting, sacrifice and devotion would finally be rewarded with a future built on love and trust. Friends had gathered, families had traveled from miles away, and the town buzzed with excitement. Yet, while the music played and guests prepared for celebration, Michael walked down a hallway that would change everything he thought he knew. On the other side of that hotel door, his bride was not waiting with tears of joy in her eyes, nor with vows ready to be spoken before God and family. Instead, she was in the arms of the one man Michael had trusted the most, the priest who was meant to bless their union. What he saw shattered more than just a promise. It destroyed the foundation of his faith, his love, and his belief in loyalty itself. And in that moment, Michael had a choice. He could walk away in silence, broken and humiliated, or he could confront the truth and expose the betrayal to the very people who believed they were witnessing the perfect love story. The next few minutes would not only shock the bride and the priest but also everyone who stood waiting for the ceremony to begin. What he did next would leave scars on an entire community and forever change how love, trust and faith were seen in that town. Before we uncover how this all unfolded, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael was the kind of man people described as steady, dependable, the one you could call at 2 in the morning if your car broke down and know he would come without hesitation. He grew up in a working-class family where promises meant something and faith wasn't just spoken about on Sundays, it was lived out daily. His friends said he carried a quiet strength, a dignity that made him the sort of man you wanted your daughter to marry. And when he met Grace, it felt as if everything he had ever prayed for had finally arrived. Grace wasn't just beautiful, though her presence turned heads whenever she walked into a room. She had an energy that lit up conversations, a devotion to her church that earned respect from the older women, and a tenderness that drew Michael in from their very first meeting. To everyone around them, theirs was the love story people admired from afar and whispered about as an example of what true devotion should look like. But love stories are rarely as perfect as they appear on the surface. Grace, though admired for her devotion, had begun to pull away in subtle ways Michael noticed but couldn't bring himself to confront. At first it was simple things. Late nights explained by work obligations, phone calls she stepped outside to take, moments when her gaze seemed far away even when Michael was right beside her. He told himself it was stress, the natural weight of planning a wedding that involved not just two people but two families and a community that expected perfection. And yet, in the quiet moments, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. Still, he silenced the doubts with trust because trust was the foundation of his character, and he believed in Grace with all his heart. Then there was Father Daniel. To the outside world, he was the definition of respectability. A trusted spiritual leader, he had officiated countless weddings, baptized children, and sat with grieving families through their hardest hours. His sermons were known for their warmth and their ability to draw people in, making the church pews fill week after week. Michael looked up to him not just as a priest but as a mentor and a guide, someone he turned to for counsel when doubts crept in or when he needed reassurance about the pressures of building a life with Grace. Father Daniel was more than just a man in a collar. He was a symbol of stability, someone the entire community trusted implicitly. And so when Grace began spending more time at the church, seeking guidance and advice from him, Michael never questioned it. To him it was natural. To her family it was admirable. But behind the smiles and rehearsals, secrets were being buried, secrets that would eventually erupt in ways no one could have imagined. The engagement party was meant to be a night of joy, a chance for family and friends to gather under the warm glow of string lights, raising glasses to the couple who had become the town's favorite love story. The music played softly, children laughed as they darted between tables, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. Michael stood proudly beside Grace, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist, while guests leaned in to tell them how perfect they looked together. But while toasts were made and laughter echoed across the hall, not everyone saw perfection. One bridesmaid, a childhood friend of Grace's, watched quietly from her corner. She noticed something others missed, or perhaps chose to ignore. Grace's eyes lingered too long when Father Daniel spoke to her. Her laughter was softer, more intimate, as though she reserved a version of herself for him that Michael never truly saw. When whispers of this observation reached Michael, he laughed it off. "Grace?" he said with a half-smile, shaking his head at the suggestion. To him the idea was unthinkable. He trusted his bride without hesitation, and Father Daniel was above reproach. These were the two people he believed in most, the woman he was about to pledge his life to and the priest he had looked to for guidance since boyhood. Michael told himself the bridesmaid's imagination had run away with her, that nerves and jealousy often distort the truth during weddings. And yet, in the quiet of the night after the party, when Grace fell asleep beside him, Michael found himself staring at the ceiling, wondering why the thought would not leave him. He brushed it away, choosing love over suspicion, loyalty over doubt. But the truth was darker than anyone expected, and ignoring the whispers would not silence what was already happening in the shadows. As the weeks moved forward, the stress of wedding planning became the perfect disguise for Grace's unexplained absences. She would leave for what she called last-minute details, or quick meetings, and Michael convinced himself that brides carried heavier burdens before a wedding day. What he didn't realize was that many of those late nights were spent not with a planner or florist, but in long, quiet conversations with Father Daniel. At first, Michael even praised Grace for her dedication, proud that she wanted the ceremony to be flawless. And when she mentioned counseling sessions at the church, Michael's heart swelled with gratitude. That's who she is, he thought, a woman grounded in her faith, a bride preparing not just for marriage but for a holy union. He could not see what others had begun to notice, the way Grace's smile softened at the mention of the priest's name, or how her phone seemed to light up more frequently whenever she excused herself from the room. Then came the night that would plant a seed of doubt Michael could no longer ignore. It was less than 3 weeks before the wedding. Michael waited at home, dinner cooling on the table, the clock ticking into the late hours. Grace had promised she'd return after a quick meeting with her maid of honor, but midnight came and went. By 1 a.m, her phone went unanswered. Michael sat in the quiet of the house they had just finished decorating together, staring at the empty chair across from him. He tried to reason with himself, traffic, errands, an exhausted bride falling asleep on a friend's couch. But deep inside, unease had begun to claw at him. And when she finally returned the next morning, her hair slightly undone and the faintest trace of cologne clinging to her dress, Michael asked gently where she had been. Grace smiled softly, kissed his cheek and said she had been with friends. What Michael didn't yet know was that her friends had included Father Daniel. In the days that followed, the questions in Michael's heart grew louder, yet every time he sought clarity, Grace met him with answers that were polished, practiced, and just convincing enough to quiet his doubt. She explained away her late nights with talk of church activities, helping Father Daniel with outreach programs, counseling sessions for young couples, or special choir rehearsals that needed her presence. Each explanation fit neatly into the life of a woman admired for her devotion to her faith. And because Michael wanted to see her through the lens of trust, he chose to accept those stories. He told himself she was simply overburdened, caught in the whirlwind of responsibilities, balancing her role as a bride-to-be and as a respected member of the congregation. Yet deep down the uneasy feeling remained, lingering like a shadow he could not escape. Michael wanted to believe her, but the lies were already stacking up. It wasn't just the absences. Small inconsistencies began to surface, the kind most people might overlook but that gnawed at Michael's mind late at night. A phone that buzzed in the early hours, messages quickly swiped away before he could glance at the screen. A laugh on the other end of the line that fell silent the moment he entered the room. Grace's sudden change in mood, sweet and attentive one evening, distant and distracted the next. Michael's friends noticed too, but when they hinted at it in casual conversation, he shut it down quickly. "She's just tired," he would say, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Because to admit otherwise would mean questioning not just Grace but also Father Daniel, the very man who had counseled him since he was a teenager, the man Michael believed was above temptation, above reproach. But whispers had already started to move quietly through the church community, and not everyone was as willing to dismiss them as Michael was. At Sunday services, Michael began to sense it. The way people's eyes followed Grace as she walked down the aisle, the hushed tones that seemed to pause when he turned his head, the polite but strained smiles from women who once praised his relationship. One evening, an older church member, a woman known for her frankness, gently pulled him aside. "Michael," she said, "I don't mean to stir anything but be careful who you trust. Sometimes the ones we look up to can let us down." Her words rattled him, though he pushed them aside, choosing silence over confrontation. Because what was the alternative? To believe that the woman he adored and the priest he respected could betray him in the same breath? To admit that everything he had built his future upon might be nothing more than an illusion? For Michael, denial was easier than truth, at least for a little while longer. But denial has its limits, and soon even Michael could not ignore the signs. One evening, as Grace prepared for another late meeting at the church, she rushed to gather her things, leaving her handbag draped across the arm of the couch. Michael, weary from weeks of gnawing suspicion, picked it up absent-mindedly, only for a slip of paper to fall to the floor. At first he thought nothing of it. But as his eyes scanned the words printed on it, his breath caught. It wasn't a church program or a florist's receipt. It was a hotel bill, dated just 2 nights earlier, for a single room under Grace's name. The hours matched the night she claimed she had been helping Father Daniel with counseling sessions. In that instant, Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. The whispers, the lies, the unease, it all pointed to the truth he had tried so desperately not to see. The hotel receipt weighed heavily on Michael's chest, like a stone he could not put down. He tried to reason with it, to imagine explanations that might make sense of what he held in his hand. Perhaps it was for a friend, perhaps Grace had booked it for someone else, perhaps anything but the truth his heart was beginning to accept. But explanations became excuses, and excuses felt hollow against the reality of his growing doubts. For the first time in his life, Michael felt like a stranger in his own story, watching a life he thought he understood slip away from him piece by piece. And so, when Grace left again the following week, claiming she needed to meet Father Daniel about last-minute counseling before the ceremony, Michael made a decision that turned him into a quiet investigator. He followed her, not with anger, but with a sinking dread that chilled him to the bone. He kept his distance, careful not to be seen, his car parked 2 blocks away as he watched Grace's figure move swiftly down the sidewalk and into a building he had driven past hundreds of times. It wasn't the church, nor a florist, nor any of the vendors she might plausibly visit this close to the wedding. It was another hotel, tucked behind a row of offices, discreet enough to avoid attention but close enough to the town center for those who knew where to look. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his eyes fixed on the revolving door as Grace disappeared inside. Minutes later, Father Daniel entered through the same door, glancing around him with the careful eyes of a man who knew he should not be seen. Michael's heart pounded, his stomach twisted, yet he remained frozen, unable to storm inside, unwilling to destroy everything in a single moment of rage. For over an hour he sat there, trapped in a storm of loyalty and betrayal, faith and doubt. This was the man who had baptized him, who had prayed over his family's losses, who had spoken words of guidance at moments when Michael thought he couldn't carry life's burdens any longer. And now, that same man was walking into hotel rooms with his bride-to-be. Michael wanted to deny it, to tell himself there must be some other explanation, but explanations crumbled when he later saw them together. Through the glass, partially obscured by the curtain, he caught sight of Grace's unmistakable laughter, her hand resting on the priest's shoulder in a gesture too intimate to be misread. He knew what he saw, but how could he prove it without shattering everything? His family, her family, the church, the community, all of it would collapse if he spoke the truth aloud. Silence, in that moment, felt like both the safest and the cruelest choice. He drove home that night with a heaviness that words could not describe. Every mile on the road stretched out like a lifetime, his mind replaying what he had seen in agonizing detail. The betrayal was no longer whispers, no longer suspicion. It was reality. And yet, he returned home to find Grace cheerful, speaking of wedding favors and flowers as if nothing were wrong, her voice filled with the same warmth that had once made him believe in forever. Michael answered her softly, hiding the storm raging within him, playing the part of a man still unaware. Because exposing the truth too soon, he told himself, might only destroy him without bringing real answers. What he didn't know was who else was watching them, who else had begun to notice, who else was quietly piecing together the truth that Michael was only just beginning to face. The morning of the wedding broke with a stillness Michael had never known before. The sun rose gently, spilling its light across the town as bells rang faintly in the distance, announcing what should have been the happiest day of his life. Yet inside Michael's chest, joy felt like an emotion he no longer recognized. He dressed carefully, each button on his shirt fastened with the weight of memories and doubts that fought for space in his mind. He remembered the hotel, the laughter, the receipt, all the signs he had chosen to bury. And still, against every instinct screaming for him to run, Michael showed up. He stood tall, not as a groom swept up in excitement, but as a man searching for answers, desperate for clarity. Grace, radiant in her gown, greeted him with a smile so flawless it could have convinced anyone in the room that love had conquered doubt. But Michael knew better. And within hours, everything would collapse. Guests filled the church, their voices echoing in gentle hums of conversation, their faces turned with admiration toward the bride and groom. To the outside world, the image was picture perfect. 2 souls about to be joined, blessed by the very priest the town held in high regard. But Michael's eyes never fully softened that morning. He watched Grace closely, every gesture, every word, searching for something hidden beneath the veil of her charm. It was during a moment before the ceremony, as he stepped into a quiet hallway to steady himself, that he heard the voices, soft, hurried, and far too familiar. Grace's laughter drifted through the slightly ajar door of a side room, joined by the low tone of Father Daniel. And then, clear as day, he heard the words that made his blood run cold: "We'll meet after this, just for a little celebration of our own, before the reception." Michael froze, his hand tightening on the frame of the doorway. The words seared into his mind, confirmation of everything he had tried so hard not to believe. His stomach churned, his vision blurred, and for a moment he thought of walking away, of letting the truth remain hidden forever. But the weight of betrayal burned too fiercely now to ignore. He lingered, silent, listening as Grace and Father Daniel whispered plans meant for secrecy, their voices carrying the intimacy of lovers rather than the distance expected of a bride and priest. Each word felt like a blade, cutting through the last threads of Michael's trust. He steadied himself, swallowed the rage building inside him, and made a decision. He would no longer live in shadows. The truth would meet the light, no matter how devastating the fallout. At 38 minutes past the hour, just as the guests began to take their seats for the procession, Michael moved with a calmness that belied the storm raging within him. His footsteps echoed against the hallway as he approached the suite where he knew Grace and Father Daniel had retreated. He paused for a moment outside the door, his breath shallow, his heart beating so loudly he thought it might give him away. Then, with a force that carried years of trust, love, and betrayal, he pushed the door open. The scene before him confirmed every fear he had fought to suppress. Grace and Father Daniel together, entangled in a way that erased any possibility of denial. The room fell silent as they turned toward him, their faces caught between shock and shame. And in that silence, Michael stood, broken but unflinching. Because what he did next, no one could have predicted. The air inside that hotel suite was so thick with silence that even the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed deafening. Michael did not scream, did not throw his fists, did not break into the violent chaos that so many might have expected from a man catching his bride in the arms of another, especially when that other was a man of God. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He stepped back, his eyes locked on theirs, and with a calmness that unnerved both Grace and Father Daniel, he simply said, "Stay exactly where you are." His voice carried no tremor, no rage, it was steady, deliberate, controlled. Then, pulling his phone from his pocket, he made a series of calls that would turn a private betrayal into a public reckoning. Within minutes, voices filled the corridor, footsteps echoed, and soon both families, along with a cluster of waiting guests, stood at the threshold of the room. When the door swung wide for all to see, the reaction was immediate. Gasps tore through the air, hands rose to mouths in disbelief, and the joyous chatter that had filled the building only moments before collapsed into stunned silence. Mothers clutched their children close, fathers stood rigid with anger, and the younger guests whispered in shock at the sight of a bride and a priest exposed in the most humiliating of circumstances. Grace's face drained of color, her eyes wide with terror as her carefully constructed image shattered before everyone she had hoped to impress. Father Daniel, once revered for his dignity, stood frozen, stripped of the authority his collar once commanded. The room fell silent, everyone frozen in disbelief, unsure whether to look away out of decency or stare at the collapse of what had been the town's most admired union. In that single moment, years of trust unraveled, not just for Michael but for every person standing in that doorway. This was not just the betrayal of a man, it was the betrayal of families who had invested their faith in a love story, of a congregation who had placed their spiritual lives in the hands of a priest, of a community that prided itself on tradition and loyalty. Whispers spread like wildfire in the hours that followed, growing into a scandal too heavy for the walls of the church to contain. Some demanded Father Daniel's resignation immediately, insisting he had broken vows greater than those of marriage. Others, torn by loyalty, struggled to reconcile the man they had once trusted with the disgrace now etched into their memory. Divisions formed, loyalties fractured, and for weeks the town became a place where every conversation carried the weight of Michael's discovery. For Grace, humiliation became her constant companion. Once admired as the woman who had captured Michael's steadfast heart, she now found herself avoided in grocery aisles, whispered about in salons, and treated with a coldness that cut deeper than any words. Father Daniel faced the fury of an institution unwilling to shield him from disgrace. Investigations began, whispers reached the diocese, and soon his place at the pulpit was no longer secure. Yet amid the ruin, one question lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed it: What of Michael? Was he finished with Grace now that the truth had been exposed, or was this only the beginning of his revenge? The days that followed the exposure were unlike anything the community had ever seen. Families who once dined together now crossed the street to avoid one another, the shame too heavy to bear. Grace's parents, who had dreamed of watching their daughter walk proudly down the aisle, could no longer show their faces without whispers cutting through the air. Her siblings, once proud to be linked to her beauty and charm, now carried the burden of her betrayal wherever they went. Grace herself, once adored and admired, became a shadow of the woman she had been. Invitations disappeared, friendships crumbled, and even the neighbors who once waved warmly from across the yard now pulled their curtains closed whenever she stepped outside. In every corner of her life, judgment followed her like a shadow that would never lift. For Father Daniel, the fall was even steeper. He who had once commanded respect with the simple lifting of his hand now found himself stripped of authority. Parishioners who had trusted him with their deepest confessions now avoided his gaze, unwilling to reconcile the man they revered with the scandal that consumed him. The diocese moved quickly, removing him from the parish and launching an investigation that spread beyond the town. His reputation, once polished by years of service, collapsed overnight. And though he tried to defend himself, the truth needed no embellishment. It had already been laid bare in the most public way possible. What had been built over decades of trust was destroyed in a matter of moments, leaving him with nothing but disgrace and isolation. And Michael, though he had revealed the truth with a strength that stunned everyone, was not free from the weight of it all. The betrayal followed him everywhere, not just in the questions that people whispered when they thought he wasn't listening, but in the quiet moments of the night when memories came uninvited. He tried to rebuild, to focus on his work, to surround himself with those who still respected him. Yet even in the midst of their support, the image of that hotel room lingered in his mind. He wondered how he had missed the signs, how love and faith could blind a man so completely. His heart remained torn between the relief of exposing the truth and the unbearable ache of what could never be restored. And so, the story did not end with Grace's humiliation, or with Father Daniel's downfall, or even with the silence that fell over the church pews. The true ending was written in Michael's quiet resilience, in his choice to carry the burden, to face the whispers, to walk forward knowing the past could never be erased. Sometimes justice isn't found in court, it's found in the courage to expose the truth, no matter the cost. And for Michael, that courage became both his salvation and his curse. Michael never married Grace. Whatever dreams they once shared dissolved on that wedding day, leaving nothing but broken vows and unanswered questions. Grace, unable to bear the weight of her own shame, eventually disappeared from the town entirely. Some say she moved to another city where no one knew her name, others whisper she never truly found peace. But the truth is simple: her once bright presence in the community was gone, and the silence she left behind was louder than any apology she could have spoken. Father Daniel, too, never recovered. Though he attempted to rebuild his life elsewhere, the stain of betrayal clung to him. His name, once synonymous with faith and trust, became a warning whispered in hushed tones, that even those we trust the most can fail us in the deepest way. Yet for Michael, the scars of that day never fully healed. He lived on, respected by some, pitied by others, but always marked by the memory of what he had seen. He had hoped for freedom when he exposed the truth, but instead found that honesty sometimes comes with a heavier price than lies. The image of Grace and Father Daniel in that room replayed in his mind like a wound that refused to close. And though he carried himself with dignity, the world would never see the silent wars he fought inside. For those who witnessed it all, the memory became a permanent reminder: betrayal doesn't just break vows, it breaks people. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free, it shatters you first. And from those shattered pieces, each person must decide how to carry on. For Michael it meant a lonely strength. For Grace it meant exile. For Father Daniel it meant disgrace. And for the community, it meant a story they would never forget. These scars, etched in memory, remain long after the wedding dress was packed away, long after the church bells fell silent. What do you think Michael should have done that day? Was his revenge justified, or too merciful? Let us know in the comments. And if this story hit you like it did us, hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking real-life stories. Because sometimes, the truths we uncover are not just stories, they are lessons written in the pain and choices of those who came before us.